Lord God, we come to you this day. We thank you that you can bring people into our lives. They can unpack Scripture. They can help us see a way forward to understand how it makes sense for our own lives. Thank you for Dr. Allen Powell and Melissa Curtis Powell sitting out in the narthex. Thank you for them being here. Thank you for everyone that is able to be here today. Bless our lives. Give us insight. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Dr. Allen Powell retired 2 years ago, right?
Maybe.
Around someplace in
like
there.
that.
COVID, you could never tell when retirement would have happened. So, former New Testament professor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. He's world-renowned, written 40 or more books, lots of journals, all kinds of different things, and it's great to have him here. He's a dear friend, colleague, and was my New Testament professor when I was in seminary. So there you go. Please welcome him here at Trinity today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Such a delight to see one's students do well. So it's such a delight. And I am really delighted to be with you all for almost a week, starting last Wednesday. And the theme, as requested from Pastor Jeff, is that we would talk about the parables in the Gospel of Luke. And we're, especially doing that today. There's a little handout that we're going to have more later, but we didn't want to print them all up till we knew how many people were here. We'd print too few and have to go do more. We'd print way too many and waste. So the one that's back there just has a sheet on parables in the Gospels. That's a little box from one of my books where it lists all the parables in the 42 parables in the New Testament Gospels, and shows where they're found. And that's one thing you might notice is there's only 3 columns, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you wonder what about John. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. That's an oddity or peculiarity of the Gospel of John. That we'd have to have another class sometime on John to figure that out. But the other thing we would notice is Luke is the most parable heavy of the Gospels. A great many of the parables, pretty much all the ones that are in Mark, are also in Luke. There's a few that are only in Matthew, but there are a whole bunch that are only in Luke. Luke is the parable heavy gospel. 17 parables that are found only in Luke and nowhere else. So that's one reason that the topic comes up. We are. I mentioned just barely on Ash Wednesday that parables are different from fables, and that parables are given to multiple meanings. Now, almost any story can have multiple meanings if people don't understand it. So sometimes people understand the story and other people don't understand it, but and read all kinds of weird things into it or something like that. But it's the very nature of a parable to invite people to read it in light of their own social context. And parables end up meaning different things to different people, especially different things to people in different cultures and throughout history. So you can take almost any one of the parables and show how it is the different meanings it has had throughout the history of the church and in different cultures and in the world today, and sometimes just to different members of the same family. And people, and that's not because people are misreading it. I mean, I suppose it could be, but it's not usually that. It's usually just because that's the way parables work. They are the genius of a parable is that you kind of the parable teller, and Jesus was the master at it, turns the parable loose, and it speaks to different people, in different ways. So the big word for that, and I'm going to start out with some kind of boring stuff, but I promise things are going to get really interesting before we're done. So hang on. I try to get through the kind of boring stuff in as charming a way as possible, but I can only do so much. The big term they use for it is polyvalence, which is at the top on the other side of the handout. And literary scholars, literary critics use this term a lot. Polyvalence is simply the, I used to like to tell people, I don't do it anymore, that polyvalence is when you have lots of little window blinds in your house, but nobody ever laughs at that joke, so I just decided to quit telling it. But polyvalence means many meanings, multiple meanings. And so literary critics will trace how a story, why does a story mean different things to different people? And people get PhDs in this, and they write all kinds of philosophical dissertations and treatises and all kinds of things on it. But on that handout, I list kind of 4 reasons that stories mean different things to different people, other than just that sometimes people don't understand the story. That one, that's not even on the handout. We're not going to, just because you have the handout, I'm going to spend a minute or so on a couple points and then move on to the ones we care about. The second one is called the manner of reception. What they mean by that is whether you read, if somebody reads the story straight through from beginning to end, and pretty much fairly quick time, the story impacts them or has a certain level of meaning. Scholars get government grants and go and do tests on things like this. But if somebody breaks it up and reads it, then the story affects them differently. I just finished doing a lot with Charles Dickens, and I discovered that almost all of Charles Dickens' novels were written to be serials. So each chapter, and they have a lot. I just read, Little Dorrit has 48 chapters or something. And what it was 1 chapter a month was published in a magazine for 4 years. So you were expected to read Little Dorrit. It'd take you 4 years to read it, with lots of time to think between the chapters. Well, I just sat down and read it, and so literary critics would say it probably didn't affect you the way Dickens expected it would affect his readers, because you weren't reading it the way he thought you would be reading it, like nobody does anymore. So that's kind of what they mean. We're not going to really talk about that anymore. Or Shakespeare scholars will say if you read Romeo and Juliet, it won't affect you the same way as if you see it performed on a stage. Oh, yeah, okay. The most complicated one, but I think it's actually sort of cool, but it would take a whole other weekend to do it, is the bottom one called conception of meaning. And this is simply people mean different things by the word meaning. Here's what we have found, is if I give you a story and ask you, what does a story mean? And you have an index card or something and you fill out an answer, what the story means. And I do that with everybody in the room. Some people will tell me what they thought the message of the story was. They'll say, well, the point of the story is blah, 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 I think the moral of the story or something. Other people will tell me how the story affected them. I will say, they'll give me an emotional answer. What do you think this story means? I found it very inspiring, or it was scary, or it was, something like that. Now, where I find this especially interesting is pastors will almost always go with message. Lay people often will not. So, and indeed, the pastor will be confused, because the pastor will say, well, what do you think this story, at the Bible study? Well, Norma, what do you think this story means? And Norma will say, I thought it was very inspiring. Well, that's nice, but what did it mean? And well, what Norma thinks it means is she thinks it's inspiring. That's what it means. So, why are pastors like that? Because professors at seminaries taught them to be like that. We trained them in their Bible courses to read Bible stories and answer, what is the message of the story? You're not going to get up in the pulpit and tell people how the story made you feel. You're going to get up and tell them what the message of the story is. So especially old pastors like Jeff, they think that way. Now, some of the new pastors like Michael Jordan might be different. Yeah, because we've kind of discovered in latter years that the emotional effect that a story has on someone might just be the purpose of the story. It might be the meaning of the story. Sometimes the author told the story not to convey a message, but to affect you in a certain way, to make you feel guilty, or make you feel grateful, or something like that. All right. See, I can hardly resist myself. I said that would be a whole different weekend, and we're not going to talk about that. But you can tell I can hardly resist. The other two things on here, social location and empathy, those become very important for parables. So what do we mean by social location? All right, here I have a fun anecdote. When I was when I was in the parish a very long time ago, as a pastor, the brand new idea was doing children's sermons. And the people in the church talked about, can we do children's sermons? The only thing I'd learned about children's sermons at seminary was don't do them. They are not liturgically proper, and the Baptists do them. If you don't want people to think you're a Baptist, do you? So I thought, well, I didn't actually care whether the Baptists did them or not. That didn't really bother me. So, I started doing children's sermons. And I didn't know how to do them. There weren't any books on it. There weren't any. So what I would do is I also didn't have any kids. So, I would invite the children up front, and I would tell them, well, here's our Bible story for today. And I would not read it to them, but kind of tell them the story. And then maybe ask them a couple questions about it, and then we'd have a little prayer, and they'd go back to their seats. Probably weren't great children's sermons, but it was making them feel part of the service anyway. So we had, very early on, we had the story of Zacchaeus from Luke chapter 19. Well, what a perfect story for a children's sermon. So I bring the children up front, and I'm telling them, well, so there's this man named Zacchaeus, and Jesus was coming to his town, and Zacchaeus goes out because he wants to see Jesus, but he's not able to see Jesus. Can you tell me, anybody, why wasn't he able to see Jesus? Well, the children just don't say a word. So I try to prompt them. I say, was it because he was too short? And this one child says, no. Well, it was kind of a surprise because actually I thought that was why. And you're up in front of the whole congregation, and it wasn't. And he says, no, it wasn't because he was too short. It was because everybody else was standing in his way. This is, he's right. I mean, he's probably been, his parents have taken him to parades or something, and he's like, I can't see. And they say, well, it's because you're too short. And he's going, look, I may be short, but my eyes work fine. There is no causal connection between height and visual acuity, this child would think. I can see this man's rear end perfectly well. I just can't see the parade because he's standing in front of me. So the kid was actually offended by my saying Zacchaeus can't see Jesus because of he's too short. He said, it's because other people are standing in front of him. If there hadn't been any other people there, it wouldn't matter how tall he was. He'd be able to see Jesus. So anyway, I take that as an example of kind of what we mean by social location. What this child was doing was reading the story in light of his own life experience, and that's what we all do when we read or hear Bible stories, whether we know we're doing it or not. We always do that. It's inevitable. And every one of us has a social location. It's now become a kind of standard thing at seminary to have the students identify their social location. And the way we could do that would be, you could you all get a tablet, and I would say to write down some things like I would say first, why don't you write down your gender? So you can write male or female or whatever you however you would identify your gender, and then we might say your race. How would you identify your race? And maybe we would say your nationality. We could ask that. Maybe age. Maybe not even the exact age, but our age range. Are you under 30, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? Do we need to keep going? Well, whatever. The marital status. Are you married or widowed or divorced or and we could keep going. Political affiliation. All those factors are your social location. And we keep listing and listing and listing. You're urban or rural or northerner or southerner. You just keep going. What literary critics have found, and this is what's going to come into play later in the day, is people understand stories in light of their social location. So here's what, apart from the Bible, some English professors or something probably got some money and they have doctoral students to do the grunt work for them and all that. And they would take a story, and they usually just find some fairly well-known story, maybe one of Aesop's fables, or maybe sometimes they even do a Bible story. I think they did Adam and Eve. I saw one place. They did like Little Red Riding Hood. I remember a professor who took that one. They take stories, and they would show this story to 5,000 men, and they would ask one question about the story. And then they would show it the story to 5,000 women, and they would ask the same question of the women. Exact same story, exact same question, and guess what? Probably no big surprise. The women would answer the question differently than the men in a highly significant statistically way. It would just be to the point that you could actually have the answers to the question on index cards, and the professor could sort them, women, man, and be right like 80 to 90% of the time. That women understood something about the story differently than men did. It's kind of interesting, maybe not, too surprising. But then they would show the story to 5,000 white American women and 5,000 African American women and ask the question, and the African American women would answer the question differently than the white American women did. Also differently than the white American men, of course. Then they would show it to 5,000 African American women and 5,000 African women. And guess what? They would keep doing things like this, and they would say, how you understand certain elements of a story depends very much on your social location. And most people didn't, then so what? Is it that, the white men are understanding the story correctly and the women are misunderstanding it? Well, not very many people wanted to say that. Or, the African Americans understand the story correctly, but the Africans don't. Well, not many people wanted to say that. That's what they called polyvalence. And they just said the stories mean a really good story can often mean different things to different people because they read it in light of their own life experience, and they hear it that way, and they have different ideas of why a character did what they did, for example. If the story just comes right out and tells you why the character does something, well, that's kind of settled. But if it doesn't, you might have, some of this might resonate with you because, you might have watched some TV show or some movie or something at home. And, if you discuss it with your spouse or something, say, well, why do you think she did that? You might have a different answer than he does or your spouse does. so you're guessing, but, you have you make a different guess. That's kind of what we mean by when we talk about social location. People read the stories differently than depending on who they are. So I always on the lookout for examples of this, and I need to update and find some new ones. But I found one I thought was really good, and it might work with this audience. Doesn't work with my seminary students anymore, and that's the movie Thelma and Louise. Thelma and Louise, which came out before any of my students were born, like in 1991. But you remember the movie Thelma and Louise? Well, you can buy it now online or download it or something. Maybe at Netflix or something. But that I looked online, and I found places online where they have the movie and you can download it, and they have a little description of it, like a 1 or 2 sentence description. And here's what one website said: Thelma and Louise. It said, a pair of gutsy, independent women discover the strength of sisterhood during a joy-riding escape from the laws of men. Well, that's the movie. I went to a different website, same movie, and here was the description. 2 female friends leave their families and shirk life's responsibilities in order to become criminals. Two different plot summaries of the same movie. Now, I don't know who wrote those descriptions, but I'm just guessing that maybe they were written by, people with different social locations. All right. I'm always kind of on the lookout for some examples of things like that. Now, and the next thing I want to talk about is empathy. But I'll pause for a moment to see if we have discussion or people want to ask some questions or something. By the way, you can always raise your hand and feel free to. And if I don't see you, just wave it back and forth or something. But I'll pause for a moment. Any questions, thoughts, comments thus far? Yes. Native Americans in South Dakota. Yes. Yeah.
Until you understood where they came from and what they were about, it all made sense. And as an adult, I think that's great. I use that with my family often. Mm-hmm. Don't judge that person until you walk a mile in their moccasins.
Yeah. Okay. People could hear that. The comment was of the Native American proverb: "Don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their moccasins." Something basically being that people understand life itself, and therefore also they understand stories in light of their experiences. And if you don't understand things the way other people do, well, it's partly because you've had different experiences than they have had. And we would generally say, rather than, instead of judging someone and deciding, well, since that's not how I understand it, you must be wrong, because surely I must be right. We try to take it as an invitation to dialogue. And if somebody tells me what some story means to them, and I think that's just kind of kooky, I try not to say that, but to say, well, tell me why does it mean? Tell me why it means that to you, or sometimes I just say, tell me more, or something. Invite them, and they might, and if they explain to me why it means that to them, I might still think it's kind of kooky, or maybe not. Maybe I'll see something in the story I had not seen before. And this is all prelude now to talking about parables, because it becomes one of, I think, the more exciting aspects of understanding the parables of Jesus. Indeed, I would go so far as to say the reason Jesus told parables is because he knew that they have this kind of potential. And he wanted his teachings and his words to be meaningful to people of all different social locations, and they would be able to find meaning in those stories. Now, I pause for discussion because there are some people who get a little uncomfortable at this point and think, well, so can stories just mean anything to anybody? Or something like that. And I never quite know how to answer that, because I guess I think, well, if you're asking can they, well, yeah, they probably can. Should they? Well, probably not. We probably want to put some boundaries where you're saying it is possible to understand the story in a way that is just bizarre, and you're just completely missing it. But I'm cautious in putting those boundaries up, and I would always want to do what you recommend and say, well, tell me more about it first and explain to me why it means that to you. Indeed, one of the things I've written on this in scholarly journals, and I coined the term, saying we want stories to be polyvalent and allow them to mean different things to different people. We won't want to say there's only one right meaning and everybody else gets it wrong. We don't want to do that. But we don't want to just allow it to mean anything to anybody, any fool thing. So I coined the term polyvalence within perimeters. And I was proud of it because of the alliteration. So I talked about polyvalence within perimeters and wrote about it in some journals, and other people picked up, and sometimes they even said Powell's polyvalence within perimeters, which made it even more alliteration. And then eventually I thought, well, this might be what I end up being best known for. And then somebody pointed out that actually nothing can really be within perimeters. It is grammatically incorrect to put an S on the word perimeter. I'm saying, I got it all wrong. I have to back up, erase the tape, rewind, start over again. I was saying parameters, polyvalence within parameters. And then they even said Powell's polyvalence within parameters. Then somebody pointed out that the word I meant was perimeters. I should have said perimeters, not parameters. There are never two parameters. There is a parameter, and something can be measured along the parameter. But if there are two things that something is within, those are perimeters. So I said, okay, so I'm probably going to be best known for a mistake. I didn't know that. I was using the word parameters for probably 5 years in print and in lectures and everywhere. And then somebody came up to me and said, "You mean perimeters?" Oh. I suppose I do. I'll go Google it. Oh, what do you know? You're right. All this time I meant perimeters, not parameters. Okay. Well, I made that as interesting as I could. We'll move on to talk a little bit about empathy, and then we'll actually get to the good stuff, looking at the parables themselves. Empathy is that the quality of just identifying with a character in the story and kind of experiencing the story from that perspective. And the reason this contributes to what stories mean to different people is because people identify with different characters. You'll read the story and you'll identify with one character in the story. Somebody else will read the story and they identify with a different character. Now, I grant that it's not always that simple. Sometimes as you're reading the stories, you jump around and you might identify with one character and then another one, or back and forth. But often we tend to kind of settle on them. And I remember in college, I had a friend who was reading Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and told me that every night when she said her prayers, she was praying for Frodo, you know, in the story and all the trials and turmoils he was going through. And I thought, well, you know, you say you're praying for a fictional character in the story, you know, and she just said, well, he doesn't seem like a fictional character to me. And, well, I mean, he's a hobbit, you know. But anyway, that was, you know, that's strong empathy. She had empathized so strongly with poor Frodo in the story that, you know, she was worried about what was going to happen to him. And, you know, we experience stories that way sometimes. There is not always predictable who we're going to identify with. They say that there's realistic empathy and idealistic empathy. Realistic empathy is when you read a story or watch a movie or a TV show or, you know, experience a story, you identify with a character because they have something in common with you. And it might not be very much. It might actually not even be something you're proud of or very flattering, but they have something in common with you. Children would tend to identify with a child in the story. Adults. A man might tend to identify with the male character, and a woman with the female character, and so on. I say if you're an architect and you read a story that has an architect as a character, you might identify with the architect for no other reason than that. Even if he's a really bad person. if he's the villain in the story, even the mere fact that he's an architect, you can't help but identify with him. As I say, if there's an ordained minister in the story, it doesn't matter if it's Elmer Gantry or Reverend Lovejoy or on The Simpsons or whatever. I always kind of identify with the pastor in the story. So that's realistic empathy. But idealistic empathy is you identify with a character because something about that character you wish you were like that character for some reason. Sometimes it might be something your therapist would have to ferret out of you. Sometimes it might be something you're aware of but don't necessarily want to admit to, but there's something about that character. So as I will say, in actual truth, I have very little in common with James Bond or Spider-Man, but you know, if I watch those movies, I always imagine it's me, you know, driving the cool car or climbing the buildings or, you know, saving the world from evil threats or something like that. That's idealistic empathy. There's something in me that wants to be a hero. You know, I want to rescue people. I want to do that. And some of you would be thinking, well, sure, of course, everybody does. No, everybody doesn't. There are people who almost never identify with those heroes. There are people who tend to identify with the victims I mean, if you always identify with the villain, I don't know. That's, you know, maybe something to talk through with somebody. But no, not everybody does. And here's my example, because I go to Bible stories. I'll read the story of Jesus healing a leper, and share it with a group of clergy, and say, well, so here we have the story of Jesus healing the leper, and so, you know what? Tell me about what you think this story means. Well, you know, the lepers were the unclean people of the day. They weren't just sick, or they just have a disease, or they were sort of outcasts. But Jesus, you know, reached out to the lepers. People probably criticized him for it, but he was bold and brave to do that. And the meaning of the story is we should be like Jesus. Because pastors are empathizing idealistically with Jesus and thinking we should overcome those prejudices and reach out to the unclean people in our world today and seek to help them and heal them. And then I'll have some lay Bible study group, you know, and the women's circle or something, and I'll read that story and say, what do you think this story means? And the woman will say, you know, I felt like a leper sometimes. and start. She doesn't go with, we ought to be like Jesus, and reach out to the unclean people in the world. She goes with, I felt like that. She's empathizing realistically with the leper. And I would never say that one way is the right way to read the story. You find the meaning in the story appropriate for you, based on who you empathize with. All right, any thoughts or kind of questions about that? We basically get that? All right, where are we on time? We're at 10:45. We can go a little while longer, can't we? I am going to, let me see, I think I am going to declare it break time, because we're supposed to take a break, and although I could have gone another 10 minutes before we took a break, I want to do new handouts for you. So we are going to take, let's say, a 10-minute break. Can we do that? Can we do that? Take a 10-minute break? Yeah. And Lila and I are going to run over there and do new handouts for you.